Welcome to the 19th Century Novel Podcast, Episode 40, Natsume Sōseki, The Heredity of Taste, Part 2. After the war, the narrator tells us, General Nogi made a triumphal return. The soldiers too were given a warm welcome, but Ko-san still had not come out of his ditch. As he thinks of the soldier who looked like Ko-san being welcomed by his mother, the narrator reveals that Ko-san was an only child whose father was deceased, making his mother's loss even more traumatic. When there is only one parent and only one child and the family is broken, like a pitcher split down the middle, the damage is irreparable. There is nothing to hold on to. A person of her age has no one she can cling to. Hoping that Ko-san would return home, she had counted the days and nights on her wrinkled fingers and waited anxiously for the moment she would be able to embrace him again. But he whom she longed to embrace jumped unhesitatingly into a trench, waving the flag, and to this day he has not climbed out again. As he would never come out of it, his mother would go after him and would throw herself into it to join him. Remembering the discomfort he felt the last time he saw her when she sobbed for an hour, and recalling his clumsy attempts at consolation, which were as likely to anger as console, he decides to defer his visit with Ko-san's mother, and instead visits the family grave, where Ko-san's body isn't buried, but his hair's here. It was common for Japanese soldiers to leave behind a lock of hair to be buried if their bodies were lost in combat or cremated on a distant battlefield. Or, as Shimazu reports, the hair was sent back from Manchuria. So many bodies remained unidentifiable, she writes, that comrades in arms would gather whatever hair they could find from any dead body of a Japanese soldier and place a few strands each in an individualized box, together with any other personal item they could find, and send it back to the bereaved family as relics of their son. When he arrives at the grave, the narrator finds a woman immersed in her fervent prayer. The narrator describes this woman in rich painterly detail. The woman stood motionless in front of a thick clump of bamboo, with its great green drops of color. The background to this scene was in shadow. Behind the woman there was an expanse of shade, due to the northern exposure, and her white face stood out against this dark background. She had large eyes, firm cheeks, and a long neck. Her right hand hung at her side, and she held a handkerchief by the tips of her fingers. The snow-white handkerchief was a vivid spot of light against the dark bamboo. I saw nothing apart from the face and handkerchief of this woman, so illuminated by the purity of their whiteness. I experienced a moment of ecstasy. Whereas in the scenes of combat we saw things from afar, now we're in close-up and in full color. From this initial description, the woman seems to offer something beautiful and pure in contrast to the grim images of the war. The narrator remains an observer until they make eye contact. She lowers her eyes to the ground, and her face flushes crimson. His observer status lost, the narrator contemplates, with his usual debilitating self-consciousness, his options. Aware that he's intruding in a private moment, he could simply turn around and walk back the way he came. But that won't do, since it'll cause her to think he must have surreptitiously followed her. Another option, he could remain where he is as silent observer, but gazing at her with a dreamy fascination would be even worse. Remembering that war strategists say the best way to get out of a desperate situation is to advance with determination, he walked quickly towards the woman. That the narrator compares his desperate situation of meeting a strange woman to a soldier's marching forward against deadly odds reveals his social phobia. in particular his anxiety about interactions with women. But his strategizing comes to naught when the woman, without making eye contact, walks past him, as if she were fleeing, and brushed against his sleeve, a pleasant perfume wafted in the air, which he thinks must be heliotrope, with its distinctive scent of vanilla. After she passed, the narrator, his anxiety dissipated, feels reassured and restored to his usual state of mind, and turns around to see her, just as she looks at him. She stands under a spreading gingko tree. Sōseki paints a scene worthy of a Japanese silk print, a passage that owes more to traditional Japanese and Chinese literature than to the Western novel. The leaves of the tree were falling and dancing, all the more elegantly because there was no wind, and touching her hair, her sleeves, or her sash. The autumn sky, waiting for the coming of winter, seemed higher than at any other time of the year. The clouds, which could have been taken for gauze, drifted so slowly that we could scarcely see them move. If we had wings to fly up into the sky, our climb would have been endless. There was no doubt that the sky made me feel that the light would never end. When we contemplate such a sky, we can sense the infinite very easily. The gingko unceremoniously divided the infinitely distant, infinitely vast, and infinitely calm sky, and was changing into a golden cloud. Nearby, the tiles on the roof of the temple, like hundreds of thousands of fish scales, black and heavy against a fragment of the clear blue sky, reflected the warm rays of the sun. In the midst of this ancient sky, this secular ginkgo, the old Buddhist temple, and the old graves that were distinguished by their calm and isolation, was this young and beautiful woman. The contrast was a sharp one. There's a magical, a spiritual quality to this description, in part because, as the narrator observes, it was exactly at this time the previous winter that Kosan, carrying the flag and exposed to the wind, had jumped into the trench targeted by the enemy guns. This quality is also imparted by the ginkgo tree, which, as here, is frequently planted at Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines, its longevity lending it a spiritual meaning. Ginkgo wood, writes Peter Crane, former dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, has been used to carve religious statues, and old ginkgo trees are commonly adorned with inscriptions or ribbons expressing the hopes and prayers of local people. The ginkgo tree is remarkable in several respects. It's a botanical oddity, according to Crane, with no living relatives. Its ancestors grew up with the dinosaurs, and the single living species has come down to us almost unchanged for tens of millions of years. It is the last survivor of an ancient and once diverse lineage that was almost extinguished by the Pleistocene glaciations, and survived only as a relic in restricted areas of eastern and central China. Unlike so many contemporary accounts of deforestation and extinction, the ginkgo tree has thrived. Drought-resistant and tolerant of air pollution, it has spread widely in Asia, Europe, and the United States, and is commonly planted in urban environments. Sōseki is struck by the sight of a beautiful woman attired in brilliantly colored kimono and sash standing beneath a ginkgo tree, its leaves fluttering down to the black earth, contrasting with the ancient temple and graves. He is overcome with a feeling of calm, of age, and solitude as these contrasts coalesce. All these things merged together in my mind and flowed into a single harmonious perception that filled me with unalloyed pleasure. The self-conscious narrator realizes this expression of the sublime can easily be dismissed and mocked, acknowledging that some people will even dismiss these outpourings laughingly as intellectual twaddle. He goes on, to deny that he's an intellectual or man of letters, but merely a researcher. This assertion, though, is belied by his discussion of Shakespeare's use of contrast to heighten the sense of terror in Macbeth, specifically what follows Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's murder of Duncan, a knocking at the gate, and a porter's subsequent wild and stupid suggestions about its meaning. Sōseki argues that rather than undercutting the murder, the contrast brought about by this comic scene enhances our terror. The atmosphere of desolation and dread that permeates the whole tragedy reaches the height of excitement through this character's facetious remarks. It could be said that his simple pleasantries manifest terror, and that the buffoonery becomes an essential dramatic component that creates a climate of fear and makes the audience shiver. Sōseki spends considerable time analyzing and explaining this scene's impact, concluding that just as someone who has been seasick on a boat has the impression that the ground is moving when he returns to dry land, so will people who read Macbeth be left with a lingering sense of terror, and not surprisingly, will project it onto things that have no relationship with terror. The English essayist and author of Confessions of an English Opium Eater, Thomas de Quincey, was equally astonished and perplexed by this scene, writing in 1823, "The knocking at the gate which succeeds to the murder of Duncan produced to my feelings an effect for which I never could account. The effect was, that it reflected back upon the murder a peculiar awfulness and a depth of solemnity. Yet, however obstinately I endeavored with my understanding to comprehend this, for many years I never could see why it should produce such an effect." He reaches a conclusion similar to Sōseki's. Shakespeare has us sympathize with the murderers. We were made to feel that the human nature, i.e., the divine nature of love and mercy, was gone, vanished, extinct, and that the fiendish nature had taken its place. Another world has stepped in, and the murderers are taken out of the region of human beings, human purposes, human desires. They are transfigured. Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are conformed to the image of devils, and the world of devils is suddenly revealed. Shakespeare removes us from the world of ordinary life. Hence it is, writes De Quincey, that when the deed is done, when the world of darkness is perfect, then the world of darkness passes away like a pageantry in the clouds. The knocking of the gate is heard, and it makes known audibly that the reaction has commenced. The human has made its reflux upon the fiendish. The pulses of life are beginning to beat again, and the re-establishment of the goings-on of the world in which we live first makes us profoundly sensible of the awful parenthesis that has suspended them. The knocking at the gate, to De Quincey, signals our return to the ordinary world, but this world has changed with our knowledge of the devilish darkness. The solid land we stand upon is moving. Sōseki also focuses on contrast. The porter's comic responses to the knocking at the gate, and thus even the most banal of human actions, become darkened with our feeling of terror. Sōseki's insightful and poetical analysis of this scene gives an indication of why his lectures on Shakespeare at Tokyo University were so well received. His inclusion of this analysis in this novella also helps give a sense of his fiction, with its digressions, its willingness to incorporate nonfiction, its use of intellectual discourses. In contrast with his analysis of Macbeth, which juxtaposes horrible murder and banal ordinary life, the contrast he describes in The Heredity of Taste juxtaposes the physical and the spiritual, youth and age, beauty and death. This contrast ultimately reinforces a sense of loss. Just as the Macbeth porter instills terror, Sōseki explains, this woman of the temple reinforced the impression of gloomy abandon. From this metaphysical impression, the narrator returns to the ordinary, seeing the chrysanthemums the woman must have laid upon the grave, and wondering where she had come from, since she had never been mentioned by his close friend Kosan. He considers following her and learning where she lives, but that would be acting like a private investigator, and he did not want to associate himself with such a vile job. Yet unable to resist learning her identity and connection to Kosan, he rushes to the temple's gates and scans all directions, only to conclude, she remained invisible. I had let her escape. I decided to talk to Kosan's mother. Perhaps I would learn something from her. At Kosan's mother's home, the narrator sees a clump of white flowering chrysanthemums, identical to the flowers laid at Kosan's grave, which his mother reminds the narrator had been her son's favorite, suggesting a bond between Kosan and the mysterious graveside visitor. Before he's able to pursue this inquiry, Kosan's mother complains that she doesn't feel well enough to go to the cemetery alone, and that no one will accompany her there, even though her friends say they worry about her and offer her advice. The narrator bemoans to himself his inability to escape this awkward interaction. When I get to a point like this in a conversation, I never know what to say. I had no idea what I could say to extricate myself from the situation, so, as I could do nothing else, I forced out the words, "Ah, yes." But the old lady seemed to want to grumble for a while. "Bother," I said to myself. But as I could do nothing to change things, I watched a tit flying from one tree to another. At last he asks her, thinking of the woman he'd seen at the grave, if a lady in her family could provide company for her, a suggestion that brings on a complaint that Kosan hadn't married, and thus she had no daughter-in-law to take care of her. A duty common in Japanese society, but a duty the narrator objects to. Rather than have the prospect of being left alone and abandoned, people prefer to count on a suitable daughter-in-law to take good care of them. But let's put ourselves in the place of this daughter-in-law. In spite of being only 20 years old, the daughter-in-law is then obliged to spend her life in the company of her mother-in-law? Is there anything crueler than that? The narrator doesn't voice this sentiment, and in fact feigns sympathy for Kosan's mother's wish, knowing that the rules of polite society require dishonesty. I am an honest man by nature, but as I live in society, I try not to arouse anyone's resentment, and sometimes I am compelled to lie in this endeavor. As soon as honesty becomes compatible with daily social life, I will stop telling such lies. In his recognition of the duplicitous nature of social discourse and his difficulty genuinely engaging with Kosan's mother, the narrator seems to demonstrate symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. Such behavioral and psychological traits are common to characters in Sōseki's fiction, This use of an overly self-conscious first-person narrator, a man mired in his thoughts and removed from direct interaction with and empathy for another, and alienated from the larger social world, is a common feature in fiction that responded to the transformative and estranging nature of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as in the work of Dostoevsky and Kafka, or in Sōseki's case, a response to the changes occurring as Japan of the Meiji Restoration evolved into a modern industrialized and westernized nation. When he asks why Kosan had never found a wife, his mother says they were looking into possibilities before he was sent to Port Arthur. She offers no further information. The narrator again is critical of his action because he is adopting the tactics of a detective. More than criticism of the detective genre, Sōseki's rejection of detection reveals something about his literary aesthetic, that he sees a narrative based on the search for a truth as false. His fiction is much shaggier, and thus, he believes, more realistic. Nonetheless, the narrator continues his search, remembering Kosan's diary, which his mother had mentioned on an earlier visit, and which he now takes away with him. He has become obsessed with solving this mystery, saying, "I absolutely had to investigate." Now, that word investigate is disagreeable to my mind. I absolutely had to do some research on the matter. He realizes he'd made a mistake by letting the mystery woman escape, telling himself that we attach too much importance to dignity and display, and that he should be more roguish and vulgar. Again, we see the narrator's preoccupation with his behavior and persona, with the fantasy that this bookish, introverted, self-conscious young man could transform himself into a rogue. The impossibility of this transformation is immediately apparent when he sees the woman's face in a passing rickshaw. Here was the dreamt-for opportunity to be more vulgar. There she was. Run after her, I told myself. I started off after her, but it was too crude to run off in pursuit of a rickshaw. Only a madman would do something so crazy. And so his quest is again thwarted by his self-consciousness, his fear of what others will think. Having missed this chance, the narrator returns home and begins to read Kosan's diary, which he discovers only dealt with his experiences in the army, and these are told in a simple, unadorned manner, and with no well-crafted sentences, and no trace of embellishment or careful composition. This concise style pleases the narrator, because it does not use the characteristically aggressive tone people often use when writing about war. Nowhere had he used vulgar and pretentious expressions like, "Our hatred reaches to the sky," "The Russians are full of arrogance," "Let's cool the ardor of those hideous white barbarians." Within some scratched-out lines, the narrator deciphers the word post office, and he comes across a passage in which Kosan had written, "As I had gone without sleep for 2 or 3 nights, I took a short nap in the trench. I dreamed of the woman I met at the post office. It's odd to dream of a woman I only saw 2 or 3 minutes from time to time. This must be a sign of how exhausted I am, but even if I had not been in such a state, I think I would have dreamed about this woman. Since I arrived at Port Arthur, I've seen her 3 times in my dreams." The narrator assumes the woman at the grave and the woman in the post office are the same, and that this mystery might be easily solved. His enthusiasm is made to fade away by what he reads next. A siege is one of the most difficult operations in modern military strategy, and it is no surprise that our troops suffer great losses, that many are killed or wounded in carrying out such an operation. Over the last 2 or 3 months, so many officers have fallen at the foot of the fortress that it is impossible to list them all. Death will come to me, too, sooner or later. As I listen to the guns of the 2 armies day and night, I wait for my turn and wonder when my time will come. On the day before his death, Kosan had written, "Tomorrow will be the day when I meet my fate. It is normal for a soldier to die in battle. To die is an honor. From one point of view, to return alive to my country would be losing the opportunity to do my duty and die for it." And on the day of his death, he had written, "Today will be the last day of my life. The rumbling of the guns that bombard the stronghold with their destructive fire never stops. When I am dead, I will no longer hear that noise. And when my ears no longer hear, someone will come and visit my grave and will bring me a gift of little white chrysanthemum flowers. A violent wind is blowing. Now I am marching to my death. I shall advance waving our flag until a shell chances to pick me out. Mother must be called." Here ends the diary. Upset by these last entries and uncertain about how to go about finding the lady of the chrysanthemums, the narrator tries to escape into his normal routine, but spends a restless and sleepless night. The next morning he goes to school and holds his classes as normal, revealing that he's a teacher as well as a researcher, seemingly then a professor. Making no progress in his search, he decides to return to a research project he had been working on about hereditary transmission. The narrator explains that he was interested in all the new theories in this field of study, and he cites a half-dozen prominent evolutionary biologists. Before long, he begins to connect his search for the mystery woman to this research into biological inheritance. He explains that, as it had proved impossible for me to find out this woman's address, there was no other way than to reverse the usual order of things and examine the lineage of Kosan and this woman. That is, instead of going from bottom to top, it would be better to go from past to present. He's doing what researchers and detectives always do when stuck, pursuing the question from a different angle. He will, in other words, explore the ancestry of this couple, hoping that the history of Kosan's ancestors will reveal something about this woman's identity and her connection to him. If they had only met accidentally in a post office, it's hard to see how this investigation could possibly succeed, other than by chance and luck. Here Sōseki leaves the path of rational inquiry and enters into the metaphysical, believing there must be some kind of karmic connection between the two, believing that something must have occurred to bring an ancestor of Kosan's into association with an ancestor of this woman, an occurrence which could clearly be interpreted as karma. He knows something about Kosan's family background, that they had lived in Tokyo, that they had been vassals of the Prince of Kishu, that there could be only a handful of their descendants now living in Tokyo, and that the mystery woman's appearance suggests she is of a high social standing, which thus means she might have connections with the Kishu clan chief. The narrator feels tremendous pride for what he foresees as the successful application of his newfound theory, thinking he was about to make a great discovery and contribute to the development of scientific knowledge, and believing his feelings on the verge of discovery are similar to Darwin's when he was developing the theory of evolution, or Hamilton's when he discovered the quaternion. Hamilton? Quaternion? Let me clarify. Hamilton is the Irish mathematician William Rowan Hamilton, who allegedly learned to read and speak a dozen languages by the time he was 13. On Monday, the 16th of October, 1843, walking along the Royal Canal in Dublin, Rowan had a eureka moment when he realized the formula behind quaternions. I2 equals J2 equals K2 equals IJK equals -1, which he excitedly carved into the stone of the bridge he was crossing. A former English teacher, I find the math behind quaternions, or, to be honest, the math behind almost anything, indecipherable. Wikipedia explains their significance. Quaternions are used in pure mathematics, but also have practical uses in applied mathematics, particularly for calculations involving three-dimensional rotations, such as in three-dimensional computer graphics, computer vision, robotics, magnetic resonance imaging, and crystallographic texture analysis. To prove his own recently discovered theory, the narrator seeks out an elderly man with knowledge of the Kishu clan, a man of bronze with a thin, long white beard, from whom he learns about Kosan's family history. Both his father and grandfather had looked after the prince's house. When asked if there were any interesting family stories, something people might remember today, the old man tells the story of Kosan's father, who had fallen in love with the beautiful daughter of a neighboring samurai. They were to be married, until a high-ranking official's son, a childhood friend of the prince, revealed his desire to marry her, leading the prince to demand that she marry his friend, requiring her family to move to Kishu away from Tokyo and her former love, Kosan's father. To confirm his theory that there's a connection between this thwarted romance and the lady with the flowers, the narrator asks the old man to describe the woman. He says she's the exact image of a relative's youngest sister who remains unmarried, and who the narrator assumes must be the mystery lady. This confirms for the narrator the logic of his search, demonstrating his long-held views in the transmission of attraction. Hence the novel's title, The Heredity of Taste. The Japanese title of this book is Shumi no Iden. The word shumi, although commonly translated as taste, Sōseki explained, in this case meant love between a man and a woman. Cases of love at first sight, such as Romeo and Juliet or Helen and Lancelot, the narrator believes, happen because memories and feelings from an era long before one's parents were born influence one's thoughts. The identification of Helen as Lancelot's love, I assume, is Sōseki comically revealing the narrator's cultural ignorance, his confusing Helen of Troy with Guinevere, wife of King Arthur. Eventually, the narrator tracks down this woman who, he says, was exactly what I had expected and was indeed the person I had met at the temple. He's reluctant to ask her about her ties to Kosan, since, he explains, in Japan, unlike in the West, there has been no progress in the attitudes towards relationships between men and women. It was therefore unusual for a single man such as I and an unmarried woman to sit down and talk face to face. He knows that he might embarrass her and find himself rebuffed. Thus he follows Kosan's mother's advice and tells the woman's brother, who's acting as intermediary, I know a lady who recently lost her son at Port Arthur and who spends her life from morning to night in sadness and solitude. I have tried to console her myself, but it is difficult for a man. And he wonders if this man's sister would be willing to visit this old woman. The brother agreeing to this request, his sister and Kosan's mother develop a close relationship. It's almost as if, writes Sōseki, the young lady has become the old lady's daughter-in-law. When the woman is shown Kosan's diary, she says, "That is why I went to the temple," which implies that she had a similarly obsessive memory of him after their brief encounter, which had led to her visiting his grave. Asked about the white chrysanthemums, she says she brought them because they're her favorite flower. The novel concludes with the narrator recalling sights from the train station, the general's tanned face and a soldier's mother clinging to her returned son, the people welcoming the soldiers, and his own weeping. He remembers Kosan, who jumped in the trench and never got out, but his final memory is of the closeness between Kosan's mother and the mystery lady, which produces tears purer and more refreshing than those he shed over the soldier's return. The novel closes with this mystifying line: "The professor apparently does not know this story." I assume the story the narrator is referring to is what's just been mentioned, the close relationship between the mystery lady and Kosan's mother, and the idea that this relationship developed because of karmic inheritance. The identity of the professor, who apparently doesn't know the story, had me baffled, since there's no clear referent, other than two of the narrator's colleagues who are identified as professors, but who are unrelated to this story. So I developed some unlikely arguments that Sōseki was using professor as a generic term for a westernized intellectual whose rationalism would make him unaware of, if not dismissive of, the karmic ties between Kosan's mother and the mystery lady, or that Sōseki was referring to himself, since at the time he was writing The Heredity of Taste, he was a professor. On this reading, Sōseki was criticizing himself for relying too much on a Western rationalist perspective. However, I discovered that in an earlier translation from 1974, this reference is clearer. The mystery woman's brother, from whom the narrator has sought permission for her to visit Kosan's mother, is himself a professor. The final sentence therefore says that this brother knew nothing of the karmic connection that brought the two women together. Such an almost irrelevant closing supports what Ito and Wilson allege, that Sōseki confessed that he had hurried to the conclusion of The Heredity of Taste under pressure of other work. While it may be narratively unsatisfying, this closing reference to Kosan's mother's relationship with a surrogate daughter should be understood in the context of Sōseki's biography, which helps us understand why this relationship draws pure and refreshing tears from the narrator. A loving relationship between mother and child was something that Sōseki did not experience. He was, in fact, abandoned by his parents. The youngest of 8 children, he was, as an infant, sold to foster parents who made a living buying and selling used pots and pans. This familial relationship did not last. As Sōseki recalls, "Every evening I was parked in a small bamboo basket along with the used junk and left unattended in front of a nighttime bazaar. On one such night, one of my elder sisters happened by and picked me up and carried me home wrapped in her kimono. I am told that I was unable to sleep, and my sister received a scolding from my father because I lay awake crying all night." John Nathan, Professor Emeritus of Japanese Cultural Studies at UC Santa Barbara, explains what followed. Sōseki was returned to his own family before he was 3, but only briefly. In 1870, at the age of 4, he was adopted by a childless couple known to his father and lived with them until he returned to his parents' home at the age of 9. He only learned, write Ito and Wilson, that his parents were his parents from the whisperings of servants. Nothing could be farther from the close relationship between Kosan and his mother, and between Kosan's mother and the mystery lady, than Sōseki's Dickensian childhood of being shuttled from one set of parents to another. Awareness of this background gives added emotional resonance to the scene at the train station, where a mother reunites with her returning son, who looked down at the old woman as if he had found something he had lost. The lack of love in Sōseki's upbringing was repeated in his marriage. With his wife, Sōseki experienced nothing like Kosan's transcendent love at first sight. His wife, Kyoko, came from a privileged background, leaving her unprepared for the traditional wifely tasks Kosan expected of her: cooking, shopping, running a household. Their extremely dysfunctional relationship is dissected by Brigham Young University professor of Japanese Van C. Gessel. Soseki's apparent unwillingness to bend from his stern attitude was matched by her regular bouts of hysteria, which intensified when she was ill or pregnant, and she bore 7 children, in addition to having at least 1 miscarriage. The profound fits of depression were paralleled by Soseki's mental imbalance, which occasionally veered toward full-blown derangement. Their instabilities must have chafed and fed upon one another, leading to a permanent rift. This background makes the narrator's belief in hereditary love at first sight seem a desperate wish fulfillment. That in the novel this love goes unfulfilled suggests Sōseki, at some level, believed such starry-eyed romance to be a fantasy. Yet, like all fantasies, it was something he couldn't let go, leading to a frustration that surely contributed to the misanthropy and misogyny critics often find in his fiction. Despite Sōseki's foray into metaphysics, this novel stands out for its depiction of war and its consequences, especially the painful suffering of the narrator. His obsession with finding the mystery woman can be read as an attempt to overcome his grief and construct some meaning out of Kosan's death, which he's able to do through the relationship between this woman and Kosan's mother. However, the use of a pseudo-scientific mixture of karma and heredity detracts from this examination of war and grief by adding a fantastic element to an otherwise realistic story. Writers often add the fantastic to realistic narratives, think of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and the fantastic has long been a feature of Japanese literature. In this case, however, the fantastic seems a contrivance and intrusion. One reason Sōseki used this device is because it was a way to get around the conventions of detective fiction, which he disliked. Bongqian Yu, English professor emeritus at Wayne State University, asserting that he saw the detective as a pathological symptom of self-consciousness, which he called a modern malady. Thus, he needed to solve a mystery without relying on what Conan Doyle saw as a process of deduction, or what Edgar Allan Poe called ratiocination. Of course, he could have avoided this problem by not including the mystery woman narrative at all, and instead sticking to the story of a man grieving over the loss of a friend in combat. Sōseki, though, disliked the naturalism that had come to dominate Japanese fiction, with its emphasis on realism and autobiography. He was critical, writes Nathan, of what he perceived in naturalist fiction as an absence of intellectual interest and emotional power that resulted from portraying reality unalloyed. Thus he sought an ending that offered something beyond what he called the gray skies of naturalism. The brighter skies with which the novel ends, though, are thinly painted onto a much darker vision, and it's this vision, Sōseki's graphic depiction of war, which makes this story memorable. A footnote to a century that saw 2 world wars and recurring genocides, the Russo-Japanese War anticipated much of the darkness to come. As Sweeney and Rolsgaard explain, the Russo-Japanese War gave to total war the demonic elements of machine guns, barbed wire, torpedoes, landmines, and hundreds of thousands of conscripted and volunteer soldiers facing each other on a scale never before seen. The climactic conflict on land, the Battle of Mukden in February and March 1905, threw 276,000 Russians against 270,000 Japanese. For a sense of the scale of this war, the 80,000 Japanese soldiers who died in 1904 and 1905 exceeded by almost a third the 58,000 American soldiers who died in the decade-long Vietnam War. More revealing, had the U.S. lost an equivalent percentage of its population, rather than 58,000, it would have seen 345,000 deaths, roughly equivalent to Union deaths during the American Civil War. Or to calculate this suffering in a different way, more than the combined American deaths from World War I, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that Sōseki refers to the war in several other works, starting with his first and most famous novel, I Am a Cat, which John Whittier Treat, Professor Emeritus of East Asian Languages and Literature at Yale University, describes as a massive, meandering, amusing, and pedantic send-up, not only of Meiji period social manners, but of the cacophony of contemporary media. And I'd add it's a satire of pretentious academic discourses. Writing this during the war, Sōseki understandably refers to the war multiple times. One chapter, in which the cat pursues rats, has been singled out as a commentary on the war. Mocking the mindless patriotism of the time, Sōseki has the cat say he's aware that Japan is at war with Russia, and being a Japanese cat, I naturally side with Japan. I have even been cherishing a vague ambition to organize some kind of cats brigade, which, if only a scratch formation, could still inflict claw damage on the Russian horde, a statement that serves as preliminary to his pursuit of rats. Sōseki uses the cat to create something of a mock epic satire by having the cat declare himself the Admiral Togo of cats, who conducts preliminary reconnaissance of the battlefield, plans a campaign, and positions his forces. The cat's considering whether the rats will appear from the cupboard, the bathroom, or the sink mirrors Japanese naval strategy. Admiral Togo, the cat tells himself, was similarly excruciated as he pondered whether the Russian Baltic fleet would pass through the Straits of Tsushima, or would steer a more easterly course for the Straits of Tsugaru, or would take the longest way around by heading out into the Pacific, and then swing back through the Straits of La Pérouse. The cat realizes he faces a similar agony of choice. In his struggle, the cat, one rat biting his tail, another his face, plummets noisily from a shelf, waking his master and sending the rats fleeing. The result of Admiral Togo's engagement was far different. Kohner summarizes the aftermath of what was the final and decisive battle of the war. Russian casualties were appalling: 4,830 dead, more than 6,000 prisoners of war, and most of them wounded, and 1,862 crewmen interned in neutral ports. The Japanese had only 117 dead and 587 wounded. In the final account, almost every warship of Russia's Baltic fleet had been sunk or captured by the enemy. The Japanese had lost 3 torpedo boats, but none of their heavy ships. Thus, while the cat's and the admiral's initial situations waiting for rats and Russians were analogous, the outcomes were far different. There's no real satire here, no depiction of wartime brutality and hypocrisy and dehumanization and incompetence. Instead, Sōseki merely uses a similar initial scene and the oddity of a cat thinking of himself as a naval commander for comic effect. In Boat-chen, a novel about a novice teacher's comic exploits in a rural school, Sōseki has the teacher/narrator comment on being a subject of public interest. I guess if you live in a small town, the sight of somebody eating some tempura seems like a big deal, right up there with the war with Russia. A central incident in the novel takes place during a victory celebration. A ceremony was going to be held at the parade ground in town. The students would be marching in the procession. When we got to town, there were Japanese flags flying all over the place. The scene was so dazzling it made your head swim. The description continues. The vast stretch of sky above the parade ground had come alive with countless pennants and banners fluttering from the tips of long poles. There were also flags flying on a network of ropes. On the opposite side of the grounds from the stage, they were busy shooting off fireworks. As one of these burst, it released a balloon with the words Nippon Banzai printed on it. Then came another balloon. This one was red and said Army and Navy Banzai in white letters. As presented in the novel, this celebration has little to do with a genuine appreciation for the soldiers' sacrifices, but seems merely an occasion for festivities. It also becomes the site of a pitched battle between warring middle schools, in an episode that parodies the war and that suggests an easy accommodation to violence and to discord within Japanese society. On his travel by train to Tokyo, where he will begin his college career, the titular protagonist of another novel, Sanshiro, meets a woman returning to her home village because she's no longer receiving any money from her husband, who had been a laborer at the Navy Yard near Hiroshima until he had gone to Port Arthur during the war. He came back for a while when the war ended, Sōseki writes, but left again for Manchuria because he thought he could make more money there. His letters came regularly at first, and money arrived every month, but there had been neither word nor money for the past 6 months. At this mention of Port Arthur, an old man came to attention. His own son was drafted into the army and died over there, he said. What was the point of war anyway? If there were prosperity afterward, that would be one thing, but people lost their sons and prices went up. It was so stupid. When there was peace, men didn't have to go off to foreign countries to make money. It's all because of the war. Later, Sanshiro gets into a conversation with an older man, a professor, who decries the state of the Japanese. We Japanese are sad-looking things next to Westerners. We can beat the Russians. We can become a first-class power. But it doesn't make any difference. We still have the same faces, the same feeble little bodies. Just look at the houses we live in. They're just what you'd expect from faces like this. Knowing that the student is headed for Tokyo, he praises the beauty of Mount Fuji, but acknowledges that it's a natural object that's been sitting there for all time. We didn't make it. Sanshiro, outraged by such talk, had never expected to meet anyone like this after Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War. The man was almost not Japanese, he felt, and he reminds himself that anyone who dared say such a thing in his home village would have been beaten on the spot, perhaps even arrested for treason. When Sanshiro says nothing in response, the man offers him some advice. Don't ever surrender yourself, not to Japan, not to anything. You may think that what you're doing is for the sake of the nation, but let something take possession of you like that, and all you do is bring it down. These comments make the narrator, having grown up in a rural village, call himself a coward for having uncritically accepted nationalist propaganda. The Russo-Japanese War and its impact on Japanese society was clearly a concern for Sōseki, so much so that it finds its way into his novels about a sentient cat, a middle school teacher, and a first-year college student, none of which have much to do with the war. While critics have noted these references, they have not considered the one work he wrote whose main concern is the war. The heredity of taste has been almost entirely overlooked by literary scholars. Since I'm dependent upon English language scholarship, it's possible this work has been more closely examined by some Japanese critics. But in the longer English language works that consider his fiction overall, and thus presumably reflect a scholarly consensus about what of his fiction is significant, the heredity of taste is either ignored or discussed in a passing sentence or two. In his book, Sōseki, Modern Japan's Greatest Novelist, Nathan doesn't mention the heredity of taste at all, nor does Byung-Chun Yu mention it in his book on Sōseki. In the 50 pages he devotes to Sōseki in his History of Modern Japanese Literature, Donald Keene twice refers to the heredity of taste, but without mentioning the war, instead describing it as tinged with an element of unreality that imparts a depth and beauty beyond the intrinsic interest of its plot, and noting that the theme of the collection in which the story appeared was the discovery of the source of one's existence. Hence, Sōseki had attributed the attraction of a certain beautiful woman to the attachment of the protagonist's father to the mother of the same woman. In his History of Modern Japanese Literature, Shuichi Kato places Sōseki's I Am a Cat in the context of the war, while ignoring the heredity of taste. The year 1905 marked the second year of the war with China, and this fact gives a bitter irony to the cat's description of the humans as peaceful recluses. They were indeed peaceful, in that the war with China had not been accompanied by any suppression of free speech or mobilization of the intellectuals by authorities. This statement is remarkable for two reasons. First, free speech was suppressed in Japan. As Naoku Shimizu notes, the combined agency of the state and the commercial sector created war images that were largely uncritical because of wartime censorship, thereby widening the gap between the artificially created world of a good war and the tragic reality of the individual war experience. And as I noted in my discussion of Naoe Kinoshita's Pillar of Fire in earlier episodes, the anti-war newspaper Heiman Shimbun was repeatedly harassed, its copies confiscated, and its owner and editors faced with lawsuits and even sent to jail. Second, Kato seems to have mistaken the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 for the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, twice referring to Japan's war with China, when, of course, while the war took place in China, more specifically in Russian-controlled Manchuria, the war was with Russia. In her examination of the cultural responses to the war, Shimizu identifies I Am a Cat as an example of the anti-war sentiment within the Japanese cultural elite, saying it criticizes the superficial patriotism as personalized by the novel's comic protagonist, but she ignores the heredity of taste. For her understanding of I Am a Cat, Shimizu cites an essay by Senshu University Professor Emeritus of Literature, Tsukamoto Toshiaki, Natsume Sōseki's nuanced views of the conflict, which actually does, albeit briefly, discuss Sōseki's story. Toshiaki looks at the opening dog of war imagery, concluding that the concept of an insane god might be derived from William Blake's poem Gwyn, King of Norway, a strange assertion given what must be many literary references to insane gods going back to the ancient Greeks. Toshiaki also argues that, for Sōseki, a war that was carried out with unrestrained violence and resulted in an appalling number of victims and incalculable damage to lives and property can't be justified as serving Japan's national interests. and that it must be attributed to an insane god, which is a personification of human destructiveness reminiscent of Freud's death instinct. While I was glad to find a critic who analyzed the heredity of taste, Toshiaki merely looks at the story's opening and says nothing about the narrator's grief, his conflicted views about nationalism, or his graphic depiction of the war. One of the few critics to seriously consider the heredity of taste, Stephen Cole, University of Oregon professor emeritus of Japanese literature and Asian studies, in his introduction to the novel, identifies what I believe is its signal achievement. Sōseki speaks out against the atrocity of war and the sacrifice of soldiers' lives, but he also protests the degradation of the individual implied by a military uniform and the mindless, squirming mass of advancing soldiers. Sōseki's intent is to show the folly of war and the magnitude of the sacrifice made by both the living and the dead. Akko Ito and Graham Wilson, in their introduction to a collection of 3 works by Sōseki, including the first English language translation of The Heredity of Taste, disagree, arguing that Sōseki's real interest is less in the tragedy of all war than in the personal tragedies of young men such as Ko-san, who wars destroy. Given the disturbingly graphic depiction of the war and what seems to be a skepticism about nationalist fervor, I sympathize more with Cole's argument. But questions about the extent to which Sōseki critiques war generally, or this war in particular, don't diminish his accomplishment in The Heredity of Taste. Published serially in the magazine Teikoku Bangaku, Imperial Literature, in 1906, readily available to Japanese scholars since then, and available to English speakers since its initial translation 50 years ago, The Heredity of Taste has nonetheless been overlooked. So why have critics ignored it, or gone out of their way to avoid discussing its depiction of the Russo-Japanese War? First, I suspect it's viewed as a minor work, a long short story that Sōseki dashed off in 6 days. Second, it's probably thought aesthetically flawed, its heredity/first love conclusion seen as preposterous, as an unsatisfying way to end a realistic account of war. Third, although its narrator has much in common with the characters in his novels, the lengthy depiction of combat sits uneasily against his more narrowly focused works. It seems out of character even for a writer as eclectic as Sōseki. The canons don't fit his canon. Fourth, its subject isn't sufficiently Japanese. It doesn't deal with the struggles over Japanese identity in the late Meiji period, and therefore seems uncharacteristic of his fiction. Fifth, but for some exceptions like All Quiet on the Western Front, Catch-22, and the things they carried, literary culture has shown little regard for war novels, their focus seen as too narrow and too masculinist, making them seem more like genre fiction than works of literature, leading critics to ignore or discount The Heredity of Taste. As it westernized, Japan sought to retain its unique nature, its Japanese spirit. In I Am a Cat, Sōseki mocks the ubiquitous emptiness of such appeals in a poem read by the cat's master. Admiral Togo has the Japanese spirit, so has the man in the street. Fish shop managers, swindlers, murderers, none would be complete, none would be the men they are, none would be a man if he wasn't wrapped up like a tuppenny cup in the spirit of Japan. But if you ask what this spirit is, they give that cough and say, "The spirit of Japan is the Japanese spirit." Then they walk away. And when they've walked 10 yards or so, they clear their throats of phlegm, and that clearing sound is the Japanese spirit manifest in them. There's not one man in the whole of Japan who has not used the phrase, but I have not met one user yet who knows what it conveys. The spirit of Japan, the Japanese spirit, could it conceivably be nothing but another of those long-nosed goblins only the mad can see? The Japanese spirit, also called the Yamato spirit, that Sōseki mocks, of course, was believed by many, as in this excerpt from a Japanese soldier's diary in World War II. The surprising zeal of the drafted soldiers fills me with confidence. My joy at being born a subject of the empire deepens as I put on my soldier's uniform. No matter the harshness of the military drill or the cold, we are the children of the sea, the young men of Yamato, never ceasing to protect the countless generations, the Yamato spirit handed down from our forefathers. So what was this Japanese/Yamato spirit handed down from forefathers and ceaselessly protecting generations? Sōseki says it's a tautology. The Japanese spirit is the spirit of Japan. But Japanese government officials and scholars did identify its defining characteristics: graciousness, chastity, faith, generosity, bravery, and above all, strong feelings of loyalty. The ultimate loyalty was to the emperor. And this concept of a national spirit was tied to the culture of the warrior. As Eiko Mariko Sinower, history professor at Williams College, explains, the Japanese spirit reinforced the use of physical force as historically valued and necessary for the defense of the country. The Yamato spirit posited that it was possessed naturally by all of Japan's people, but took the particular form of the way of the warrior for samurai. This notion of a unique Japanese spirit that was embodied in warriors serving the emperor encouraged belief in the nation's military superiority, its soldiers and sailors possessing an unconquerable character that was given voice in the cry of Banzai. To the Port Arthur veteran Tadayoshi Sakurai, the willingness of Japanese soldiers to sacrifice themselves in suicidal assaults was the consolidated essence of Yamato. While Sōseki did not dismiss nationalism, and in fact sought to preserve Japanese national identity from Western cultural hegemony, and at times endorsed the concept of a Japanese spirit, he nonetheless criticized how mindless and reactionary this belief could be. This skepticism would be absent from most public discourse, which would uncritically promote a concept of a unique Japanese spirit, an ethno-nationalism, as the nation became increasingly militarized and as Japan expanded its empire. Belief in racial and cultural superiority depends upon a belief in others' inferiority. This perception would motivate Japanese troops in World War II to mistreat, to torture, abuse, and murder inferior enemies. In the Heredity of Taste, Sōseki captures this spirit, this belief in Japanese exceptionalism in its early stages, before it became inextricably bound up with the nation's militarism and imperial expansion, and before similar ideologies would be adopted by totalitarian regimes in Europe and elsewhere, imaginatively and accurately rendering almost without precedent the horrors of modern warfare, and showing the allure of a militarized ethno-nationalism. Sōseki in the Heredity of Taste anticipated the many killing fields to come. For a transcript of this episode, along with the bibliography and other materials, please go to 19thCenturyNovel.podbean.com.